to look at questionnaire selection and evaluation. You've already looked at this quite a bit, but we're going to go a little bit more into detail about how questionnaires are assessed, how we can evaluate them, and emphasize again what you should be using for your projects. So we've talked again quite a bit about this. The options that you have for questionnaire selection are ideally you'll find a validated measure, and just to reemphasize, a validated measure is one on which a validation study was conducted that you can then use to reference in your study. If there is no validation study for a measure you want to use or for a construct you want to assess, the next best option is to find other research that has looked at a similar construct and see if you can adapt the survey methodology they used in their study. Now, this isn't technically a validated study, but it still helps to be able to have a reference and say, these researchers were studying the same thing that I was in a different context, and this is how they assess the construct of interest. As an absolute last resort, and you can only really do this after you rule out the previous two options, and only under certain special circumstances where you're assessing something that can't be done with a validated measure or hasn't been assessed in a way that you can adapt, you can create some of your own items. But again, we really discourage this, and we want you to try to find one of the first two options if at all possible. So now we're going to talk about how you can assess the quality of a measure. And so there are, of course, practical considerations, and these include suitability for your population. So is it age appropriate, gender appropriate? Is it in the correct language or an appropriate language for your population? Is it culturally appropriate? Those types of things. And then, in our case, what we really want is a measure that's suitable for U.S. college students. You don't want something for children. You don't want something for a non-primary English-speaking population, things like that. Another issue is accessibility. Some measures cost money to use. You will sometimes see studies that validate measures that are actually proprietary. This is more common in cognitive assessment with IQ tests and things like that, but you will sometimes see it with smaller surveys. And of course, this is fairly inaccessible for us since we don't have any extra funding to purchase the proprietary scales. The more important substantial considerations that you need to think about are the psychometric considerations. And the two big psychometric considerations are reliability and validity. Reliability is like the consistency of a measure. So the classic example is that with a scale, every time you step on a scale, assuming you haven't gained or lost a ton of weight, you're going to get the same reading. The other important psychometric consideration is validity. And validity is about whether a measure is providing information about the construct it's designed for, and whether the information it provides is useful. So if you step on a scale and measure your weight, it tells you about how heavy you are. It's telling you the thing you want to know about. And then once you have that information, it can help you make decisions about your behavior. Do you want to lose weight, gain weight? Are you at the weight that you want to be? This information is of practical significance. So there are a few different types of reliability. There's temporal reliability, which would be reliability over time. This is often called test-retest reliability. And this is whether a measure produces the same results in repeated administrations. So you'll see this in validation studies a lot, where they give a population or a sample a measure, and then they take the same people, and they give them the same measure again at some point in the future, and they want to check whether they're getting more or less the same results. Another type of reliability is internal consistency, and this is whether the different items on a scale or measure tend to correlate with each other or hang together. If you're measuring a construct like loneliness, does one question that is supposed to tap into loneliness correlate with the response to the other items that are supposed to tap into loneliness? If a measure doesn't have very good internal consistency, it would be considered unreliable because it isn't actually giving you information that's consistent with the expectations of your construct. Finally, there's external consistency, and can be one example of this is inter-rater reliability. And this is more common in situations where an assessment is being done a little bit more qualitatively, where maybe you're in an interview setting or you're doing a clinical evaluation, and you have different raters uh, rating the behavior of a subject, and you want the different raters to have more or less the same ratings for a particular assessment. If they tend to have very different ratings from each other, then the assessment you're doing probably isn't very effective, and it can be considered unreliable. The main type of reliability that we're interested in is going to be internal consistency, since we're not doing multiple tests, as in test-retest reliability, and we are not doing a more qualitative interview assessment, as with inter-rater reliability. But we will see if you have a validation study, you're going to see Cronbach's alpha reported, which is a measure of internal consistency. There's some other similar variants on Cronbach's alpha. So you may even see this if you don't have a validation study. You'll often see Cronbach's alpha reported in non-validation studies that use a particular scale or measure. As for validity, there are a number of different aspects of validity that are important to consider. One is face validity. So face validity is really just sort of like an intuitive validity. It's, do the items make sense for the construct that you're thinking about? So if you're measuring depression, one of your items shouldn't be about what someone had for lunch that day. That's not a very good item for assessing depression. Another would be content validity. So content validity is sort of about the breadth of your items. It's whether they cover the full range of a construct. So, for example, think about a construct such as extroversion. There isn't so much a concrete thing called extroversion. It's sort of made up of a lot of other different ideas as well. So think about what the different components of extroversion are. Try to describe it to yourself and think of words that you associate with extroversion. If you're making a scale that is meant to measure extroversion, you want your scale to cover all those different ideas. So that's what content validity is. And finally, there's construct validity. And construct validity is sort of the backbone of the idea of validity. And this is whether you're actually measuring the construct you're intending to measure. So the way this is often tested in validation studies is the researchers will check whether their measure is correlated with other measures for related constructs. This is known as convergent validity. And they'll check whether it's uncorrelated with measures for unrelated constructs. And this is called discriminant validity. So they'll take other measures that have already been validated and they'll compare them with the one that they are in the process of validating. So for example, with the loneliness scale that several of you are using, in the validation study, they checked whether it would be correlated with depression, and they expected that it would, and indeed it was. Then they also compared it with a measure of risk taking, and they expected it wouldn't be very highly correlated with risk taking, and indeed it wasn't. So these are examples of convergent and discriminant validity. In terms of what you have to report in your study, don't worry too much about reporting validity. You should use a measure that is valid, and you should be able to understand that it's valid when you read your validation studies, but it's not something that you're going to have to describe in your paper. What you should be thinking a little bit more about in terms of what you have to report for your paper is reliability. You'll often see reliability reported in studies that aren't validation studies. And so here's a little guideline for Cronbach's alpha and how it can be assessed. So the most important one is here at the top where you see the alpha values. You also see some criteria for inter-rater reliability and test-retest reliability. Again, we're not as concerned, especially with inter-rater reliability. You might see test-retest reliability reported in your validation studies, but the one that you really are going to have to think about possibly reporting in your study is Cronbach's alpha. And so there are some, at the top of this table, some values for the strength of Cronbach's alpha. Finally, if you are going to make up your own items, and again, highly discouraged, only do this as an absolute last resort, here are a couple tips and pointers for what you should do. So keep items short and simple. You don't want to make your reader have to read too much. A lot of times when people are reading lots of items, they'll tend to skip over pieces, and you're less likely to get consistent, reliable results with long, complicated items. Also, avoid double-barreled questions. You want your questions to ask a single thing. You don't want to ask more than one thing in the same question. Avoid technical terms. You don't want to try to confuse people. You're not trying to show them how smart you are or how much you know about something. You want them to understand the question that you're asking. So don't use confusing terms. Avoid leading questions. So you don't want to imply the answer that you're looking for in the question you're asking. Avoid emotive or moral questions. So you don't want to imply that you have some opinion or that you that there's some morally correct response to a given question. And also consider the order of items. Sometimes you'll have different items that might affect how subsequent items get answered. And so you want to try to reduce that as much as possible. You want each item to impact subsequent items as little as possible.